thank everybody present here in this panel on populations in vulnerable situation and open government. We should make this remark because our agenda said vulnerable populations, but from the viewpoint of rights, we are talking about populations in vulnerable conditions. On behalf of Milena Martinez, who could not be here with us, who is the coordinator for the Americas of the OGP, I welcome you to this panel. I am Brando Flores. I am coordinator of social innovation and citizen participation of the Leadership Institute Simone de Beauvoir. I will be moderating the panel. Please remember to follow us on the social media through the hashtag OGP Argentina. And without further ado, I want to introduce and thank our speakers. First, Mariana Barrera, Assistant Director of Sustainable Development of the Ministry of Interior, Public Works and Housing of Argentina. Dominica Mezcua, Officer from the Program of Right to Information, Article 19 of the Office for Mexico and Central America. Luis Bonilla, Director of Institutional Relations from the Techo Internacional Organization from Chile. Renae Green, co-founder and Associate Director for Policy and Advocacy from the organization She Is Me. Mary Francoli from the Carleton University from Canada. Pablo Vitale, coordinator of the area of right to the city of ACIG from Argentina. Now, as this regional meeting started today, there were some words expressed. Inclusion, one of our pillars of participation, and the social reconstruction of trust between the citizens and institutions. Rather than citizenship, persons and institutions. And these are the challenges faced by the regional meeting. And this leads us to think on how to build this relationship, how these specific populations may be included or are included in this process of open government. Can we think of an open government without this inclusiveness? And also, what are the practices we should build and strengthen for this to become a reality? We will have a first round where our speakers will describe the work they are currently working on, and then we will open up to the floor so that the public can give us their comments and questions. And if we have more time, we will answer the second question, the challenges and good practices to be strengthened. Without further ado, we will now give the floor to the first speaker. I'm Dominica Mezcua, and as we have 5 minutes to speak because we are many, I will apologize beforehand because I will read my notes, and we will have some time to talk later on. In Mexico, rural indigenous communities face and suffer numerous obstacles, both structural and institutional, of access to any information, including information safeguarded by the governments. Factors such as the digital divide, class, gender, and ethnic discrimination, and reluctance from authorities against accountability are some of the factors preventing these communities from overcoming these vulnerabilities. In the most marginalized communities in Mexico, the lack of access to information is another way of control, violence, and discrimination. Not having basic information for decision-making in daily life increases, as I said, the vulnerabilities suffered historically by these populations. In this context, Article 19 in Mexico, for the past 2 years, has implemented a project, the main purpose of which is to provide training to women in rural and indigenous communities in the state of Chiapas North in the access to information as a tool to have access to other rights. Through requests for information, the women we work with have had access to information that in most cases have enabled transformations within their communities and have supplemented the lack of proactive transparency policies for the benefit of their peoples. Through workshops, they have detected that it is key to have information on the provision and accessibility to healthcare, education, housing, and water services, among others, to have access to them on the criteria of allocation and termination of social programs so that they are no longer politically coerced through them, as well as on the planning, development, and execution of mega projects to defend their land and territories. The appropriation of a right for the women we work with is related to this ability to connect them with experiences that are directly related to their daily needs. That is to say, when they find a practical implementation that evidences a contribution for the resolution of the conflicts they experience. Thus, the right to access to information has been apprehended as a way to demand and ensure other rights in a context where this new knowledge has proven to be useful as a tool for other fights. We should not forget that in many rural and indigenous contexts, there is still this idea that women should not be engaged in public decision-making. Although at the beginning there was some resistance, women started gaining a better position in their communities. The fact that they had information allowed them to gain space in political areas where they were not involved before, and that changed the relations of power between men and women. Though we cannot say that there is gender equality, there is still a lot to be done. These communities of rural and indigenous women have appropriated the right to information as a tool to demand other rights. But the truth is that knowledge is not enough when the time comes to have access to public information and they are faced with walls that prevent them from having full democratic access. Although this experience has resulted in significant achievements, nevertheless, public access to information in Mexico represents obstacles for many communities. In Mexico, the transparency system takes for granted the fact that the entire population has access to internet. And from this perspective, the transparency and accountability mechanisms were developed, and that increased the exclusion of the most remote and poorest communities. It is not enough to develop autonomous mechanisms for groups and communities that we accompany if, when we think of an open government, we do not take into account the digital divide and the various structural barriers that a significant portion of the Mexican population faces. A country with 800,000 monolingual people who do not speak Spanish, 64% of which are women and 35% are men. The challenge we all face is to think of an open government under a foundation of inclusiveness. We men and women, the enlightened and the connected ones, should not be the point of reference, but the always excluded population should be considered to establish a dialogue on prevalent challenges. Thank you very much.
I have to speak in English, so I wish I could try in Spanish. I did frame my remarks around what are some of the challenges and what are some of the opportunities. I thought that was a really good starting point or continuation for today's discussion. And I think what I have to say will actually overlap a bit with some of the things that I've already been hearing so far today and earlier this week. So I'm going to be talking about two challenges in particular and one kind of set of opportunities that I see for dealing with the issue of vulnerable populations and open government. So the first challenge that I identified, I don't know if you would say I did this in any sort of systematic way, it could be more of an observation based on the Canadian context, but is that we really need to better understand the needs of vulnerable populations and how they might be impacted by some of the open government reforms that are taking place, especially within the context of the national action plans. So if I take access to information just as one example, the government is really, or governments, if we're talking about different levels of governments, the primary holder of information, the primary holder of data about people, about societies, and vulnerable populations need that information, that data, for different purposes. So let me give you the Canadian example, because that's where I'm from, that's what I know best. And the example of our Indigenous populations, and I say populations because they're really not homogeneous, they're quite diverse. So we have our Indigenous people, and for those of you who might be familiar with Canadian history, you'll know that we've had many policies historically that have been very hurtful to Indigenous people in Canada. And that's putting it very mildly, and that pain is still felt today in Canada. So today we're in a period of reconciliation, and it's a difficult period, it's an emotional period, and it's a very fragile period as well. And so what's happening with access to information right now is kind of straining that period. It's testing that fragility of the reconciliation period. So right now we have a bill before Parliament that's to amend our access to information legislation. It's something that we've been calling for a long time in Canada. Our legislation is from 1983. It doesn't really work with the digital age. And so it's kind of working its way through Parliament, and the Indigenous people are saying, hey, you didn't ask us about that. You didn't consult us about that. And actually, if we start to look at this new legislation, this is going to make it way more difficult for us to submit access to information requests. And we need that for very particular purposes. We need that for our land claims work that we're doing. We need that for grievances. We need that to learn about the education and the health of our populations. So it's very problematic, and it's kind of putting more of a strain on that idea of reconciliation and is really problematic in the context of this legislation. So that's one big challenge, is just kind of learning about how OGP commitments could potentially impact these populations. The second challenge is perhaps more difficult, maybe, to learn to be more sensitive to different conceptions of open government and learn more about what those conceptions are in the context of other populations. So here I want to tell you a bit of a story. Earlier this year, I went to a really great conference in Ottawa on transparency. And there was an Indigenous woman, her name was Gwen Phillips. She was a member of the Ktunaxa Nations in Western Canada. And she listened very politely the whole time, and then she stood up and she said, and it was so powerful, I understand what you're talking about with reference of transparency, but to my people, we don't guarantee this by legislation. To my people, we guarantee this by inviting someone else into the room, inviting multiple people into the room to hear conversations. So it's fine what you're doing, but that's not how we do it. And maybe you should understand how we do it, because that might impact the way that you're thinking about transparency. that might impact the sorts of commitments that you're making in your national action plans. And if we think of that, it's very powerful because that oral tradition, that oral history, that emphasis on storytelling really doesn't work that well with many of the conceptions of open government that are emphasized within the context of the OGP and that we're seeing normalized in the commitments of many of the countries within the OGP. And that's not to say what's happening is bad either, but that's just to say that, hey, maybe there's another way of thinking about things that could be better understood and should be better understood moving forward. So those are kind of my, I guess, two big challenges I think we're facing. And in terms of opportunities, I think the opportunities are for government and civil society to better engage with vulnerable populations and engage with them in a way that's culturally sensitive and in a way that's informed. And to understand their unique needs and to ensure that OGP commitments are not negatively impacting them in the context of open government. And then also to ensure that they're a part of the OGP process. This hasn't really been the case on a large scale in Canada. There's been one woman, the woman who I mentioned, kind of pushing and did manage to affect some change in one of our action plans. So engaging vulnerable populations throughout the OGP process, I think, is very important. Thanks.
Hola. That's the only we'll go with that. So my name is Renee Green. I'm from Jamaica. Jamaica signed on to the OGP last year, but we have been very inactive for the most part. My organization is a trans organization known as Transwave. Apart from the other one that I was also a part of known as She's Me Jamaica, which is an organization for trans women. Transwave deals with trans issues overall. Jamaica doesn't have an indigenous population, but for the most part, our vulnerable population would be LGBTI people, women and young girls. We have a huge problem with gender-based violence and sexual violence towards women, specifically trans women, who account for a majority of LGBTI people who are killed yearly. A lot of the work that we do is around sensitizing the general population about LGBT issues and about LGBTI people, so that people can understand that we are here and we are entitled to be here and we deserve to live and we deserve the same fundamental rights and freedoms as everybody else. The problem is that many of our citizens aren't even aware of the OGP and what the OGP is and what the mechanism that it is and how it operates and what it does, and what that would look like for Jamaica and the impact that has for Jamaica, seeing that we are a signatory to the program. Our government isn't really forthcoming with information. We have a few legislations that's currently being discussed to be tabled and to be made laws, and really what they did with those legislations were to handpick NGOs to come into a discussion and say this is what we're doing, and even though the NGOs that they selected made recommendations about these various legislations that they're trying to put in place, they completely ignored those recommendations and did their own thing. And it was when it was being tabled in Parliament and there was public outcry that they decided to inform the citizens about the legislation and how it will impact them. And now they're having open discussions about these types of legislations. LGBT people aren't recognized legally in our country. There are no laws to protect us. And while being gay in Jamaica is not illegal, certain acts between consenting adults of the same sex are illegal. And they will be found in various legislations like our buggery laws and our Sexual Offences Act. Two men aren't allowed to hold hands because that would be known as indecent exposure. Two men aren't allowed, and it's really, a lot of our legislations are very specific towards men. Gender identities aren't recognized in Jamaica apart from men and women, so trans people aren't recognized legally as well. And trans women face the most form of discrimination of any other group within the country. So we have a lot of that we're dealing with and that we have to face. And I think the OGP as a mechanism for accountability, in my opinion, the country can stand to gain a lot from it, because we don't have a culture where we do hold our government accountable. We have a bipartisan system, so there are only two political parties that really vie for power within the country, and it's between either one. Right now, it is the Jamaica Labour Party that is in power, and while they're a little bit more lenient than the other party, which is known as the People's National Party, they still have some core fundamental principles which are very dangerous for the LGBT community in our country. So there's a lot of work that we need to do around legislations. There's a lot of work that we need to do around even how the community is perceived as a people. And I think that the Open Government Partnership, if we can get our country to actually start doing something, we can create an action plan that will be able to benefit all citizens and not just some. It's a long road, and it's a hard task, but we have been doing it for years. The parent organization, which is JFLAG, has been working for 18 years trying to protect the rights and the fundamental freedoms of LGBT people in our country. And things have been improving slowly, especially for gay men, but as it relates to trans women and other people of trans experience, it is still difficult. Trans people are killed, at least 2 are killed almost every month, and so far for 2017, I think the most trans women have been killed during this year. So there's a lot that we do need to work on, and there's so many issues that we have to face. Women and young girls also, because our country does have a culture of sexual violence towards women. Women are seen as objects in our country, and they're seen as not having rights, and they're seen as things that men can use and abuse as they see fit, which of course the women's movement in Jamaica has since 2016 gotten stronger, and where women are now standing up for themselves and are advocating for legislative changes and protections for them, which is slow, but it is happening. And while even though we're trying to have those spaces be inclusive of trans women as well, that is still another journey to take. So I'm hoping that through this initiative, we can at least start some work to move forward with the government, and at least that we can have a seat at the table, a real seat at the table. Because what our government does most often than not is to pretty much tokenize the whole process. So they will have civil society come in after the decision is made, and we really don't have a voice because their decision was already made, and they just have us in so that they can look good. Which is not something that will affect real change, and that is not something that will benefit any citizen at all.
Gracias. Bueno, yo vengo de...
I come from the Techo organization. Techo is a Latin American organization working together with informal settlement communities in more than 65 cities in the region. And just to give you some context of the work that we do, let me begin by sharing with you 2 pieces of data about the Latin American territory and the reality in which we operate. A lot has been said about the fact that Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. I think that is like an unfortunate brand that identifies our region. At the same time, Latin America is the most urbanized region in the world. Approximately 80% of the Latin American population lives in cities. These 2 realities, these 2 characteristics of Latin America lead to a problem, and that is social and territorial exclusion for most of the urban population in the region. Approximately 25% of the urban population in Latin American cities live in informal settlements. What does this mean? 105 million people live in these conditions. Basically, it means that in that territory, you have the convergence of different forms of social vulnerability. You have spatial segregation, educational problems, exclusion from basic utilities, problems in terms of overcrowding and access to housing. And this has led to a creation of walls around the cities. Sometimes they take physical form. We have seen a lot of photos with walls dividing the formal city from the informal city. And we also have some other types of walls, symbolic walls, legal walls, cultural walls. And this causes the population living in these informal settlements to experience the closest side of governments. Why do we talk about the closest version or the closest side of governments? Because we see different characteristics of the relationship between the public sector and governments in particular and the population. On the one hand, this is based on our experience working with hundreds of communities in Latin America. There is a lot of invisibility. Usually, these population groups are invisible for official statistics from surveys, consultations, democratic and participatory processes exclude them. So just to give you an illustrative figure, quite recently, the ECLAC published that only 7 Latin American countries can report on the 11.1 indicator of the SDGs, that is, urban population living in informal settlements. There are only 7 countries in the region that can provide that figure. So we see a lot of invisible population. Working in Chile with communities of people in these informal settlements, we have seen that 40% of these camps have not been accounted for with the official census. But at the same time, we have another problem. When they are made visible, they suffer from the repression of the public sector. Our data also reveals that approximately 3 out of 4 informal settlements have no security regarding the ownership of the land. So they are always facing the potential problem of being ousted from the territory where they live. So in Argentina, 10% of the informal settlements surveyed by us feel or know that there is some danger of being expelled from those territories. So this is perhaps the hardest perspective of these living conditions in Latin America. And once they are made visible, once there is no repression, we may have also a more utilitarian use of these populations by the public sector and other sectors, because oftentimes, we have seen this together with community leaders, and I had my first-hand experience on this. Oftentimes, politicians see in these groups the potential for getting more votes, so they come closer to them whenever they are in an elections period. So there is a challenge for the open government model, and that is to build a new territorial social pact that will lead to the construction of a new relationship between governments and these populations. We are talking about approximately 25% of the Latin American population living in cities. This territorial social pact should be founded on 3 pillars. We have identified some public policies at the Latin American level that could help shed light in this.
One is to recognize this population. It doesn't mean just to make it visible and to get some figures and see how many people live in a certain settlement. It is also important to identify who they are, who is living in such a community, what their aspirations are, what their dreams are. So that is one challenge. At the same time, we need to appreciate that way of inhabiting the city in a social manner. These are social production spaces that relate to the exclusion from the market because these people cannot have access to the market through the traditional mechanisms. They cannot buy a house, but there is also a lack of public policies. So it is very important to acknowledge that there is a legitimate way of producing city life in these spaces. And in our experience, in addition to recognizing and appreciating that, we can escalate certain practices and certain knowledge that comes from this type of living that can give us new ideas on how to establish the relationship between the public sector, the civil society, and these communities. For instance, community practices. According to information we have, approximately 80% of the communities and informal settlements organize themselves to manage some basic services, to improve the land ownership security. And I always compare this with another element, and that is that there is a lot of distrust in Latin America. Democracy is significantly undermined. I don't know if you saw the index of trust in democracy in Latin America. Institutions are also undergoing a significant challenging process, and 80% of the communities organize themselves to manage their own basic services, to build their own houses, and to secure land tenure. So there is a lot that we can learn from them. So when we talk about transparency, accountability, participation, and co-creation, we have a lot to learn from these communities. So we need to start building a new territorial perspective of the government and the link between the government and other sectors. And this should also lead us to new ways of building the city and to address sustainable development in Latin America. Thank you.
Bueno.
Good afternoon. First, let me thank the team of the Argentine Modernization Minister that is hosting this meeting and allowed us all to be here. Before describing our project undertaken within the framework of the OGP, let me tell you first what we do in the Undersecretariat of Habitat and Human Development. Fortunately, my turn comes after Luis' presentation, who's made a diagnostics of the Latin American situation, so I'm going to skip that part. So let me tell you that in our secretariat, we conduct the state policy of the National Habitat Plan, which seeks to overcome the social and time or temporal gap. We are allocating significant resources on a yearly basis, $600 million to reach 500 vulnerable locations throughout the country. When in December 2015 we started our mandate, we didn't have a clear diagnostics on the vulnerability situation or poverty situation of Argentina. That is when we heard about the OGP, and the Undersecretariat set up a dialogue for a mapping of all informal settlements of the country. This was a major challenge, considering that for years in Argentina there was no information on poverty. We knew that there was a lot of work that had already been done, that we were not here to reinvent the wheel, that there were social organizations, academia, provincial and local governments that had been working on this. So our challenge was to articulate, leverage, and make all this work visible. And that's how we started in June 2016. And we started with the monthly meetings. The truth is that it was an extremely great work. Pablo is beside me. We've been working together for over a year, and it was an extremely difficult work. Monthly meetings were not easy, with various complications, demands, and problems. I'm not going to give you details on that because I only have 5 minutes, but let me group them into 3 categories. The first and the most important challenge was to develop a common goal and to build a common dialogue and language. We are working with vulnerable populations, and Argentina's reality is very painful. There have been and there are still many unsatisfied needs, and we were in a technical discussion table, and there was a big divide between the expectations of the organizations and what we could offer from the government through this dialogue space. The second problem, which is well known and common to many countries, was the articulation with the other departments of the national government. We overlap sometimes our actions, so that was an obstacle to overcome. And the third challenge, which was a surprise to my team, is the reluctance of actors in sharing their data. And it's not just the government. When I say all actors, it's all actors. Nobody wanted to share the information they had been working on. So the good news is that after the 1 year, we have achieved our goal, which was to launch the Habitat Plan, Open Habitat Plan. If I can please ask you to show the platform. We launched the online platform in August this year. It is an open data platform, and the good news is that it's not just diagnostics, but based on the work of the Open Government Roundtable and upon request of the organizations, the Ministry and the Secretariat agreed to publish the data on the 500 works we are conducting in the national territory. This is the information on the habitat, but also the status of the works and the progress of execution. We are very happy because this was a significant achievement, a huge effort. But this is not the end of our work. We have a challenge ahead of us, which is to institutionalize the dialogue, and that the Open Habitat platform becomes a reference, a point of reference for the rest of Argentina in habitat-related matters. We public servants are to leave in 2019, and this platform, this work, should not be just a snapshot, but a long-term action. And based on the unanimous decision of all members of the roundtable, there was a commitment to extend this for an additional 2 years. And that's a big step. And for the success of this effort, we should base our work in the learning of the past year and a half. We know that open government and participation help us develop institutionality. That is fundamental. But it is also true that open government and participation are scary. And for many people, it means a threat. So the challenge for us, not just the Assistant Secretariat, but all of us here face the challenge of proving and showing that this works, that we can build better public policies with open government and participation. And for that, we need to show results. And this is very personal, but here we shouldn't be megalomaniac. We should start with a minor thing. We should show that it is possible. We should show everybody And let me use this word of the open government jargon, co-creation. We should make our challenges collective challenges. And it is crystal clear that we cannot do this without political decision and the commitment of all players. So to conclude, the platform is gone, but to conclude with my team, Mariela Nerome and Daniel Guevara, who are here with us, first, we want to express our deep gratitude to Marina Klewen-Sewick from the Habitat Secretariat, who showed her confidence on us to lead this project. And finally, but not least, to thank all the organizations and representatives who joined this roundtable, because despite we have not been able to meet all their expectations, they nevertheless continued participating and owned the project. Thank you very much.
I would also like to show my appreciation to the OGP organizers. And now I will speak about the city of Buenos Aires, and I'm going also to focus on the problems of informal settlements. In our Civil Association for Equality and Justice, we support the fight for improving living conditions in the city of Buenos Aires, and we have been in this fight for 15 years. This is the place in the city of Buenos Aires. The city of Buenos Aires is a rich city where we have a lot of violations of rights, rights that have not been respected for decades, despite the fact that there is a legal framework that supports these citizens so that they can improve their living conditions. So we have the formal recognition that is absent and the initial steps that are being taken to make sure that the communities can add to their collective action repertoire these tools that are also available now and were not so used in the past. In this process, we also got to know some other dimensions of the problem, the symbolic walls, the ways of making territories visible or invisible, and there is a patent, a clear situation that we have seen that is making these communities invisible in the maps, in the Google Maps. Informal settlements were made invisible. So we created a platform that is called caminosdelavilla.org, where the main goal was to restore or to solve this problem of invisibility, trying to bring all the streets, the corridors, and the meaningful places for these neighbors in these settlements that did not appear in the official maps, so that people living in those areas could also highlight and identify the location of problematic areas and the problems they face on a daily basis. So we were attaching new value to the need of showing what the population built on its own in terms of the construction work they did in that part of the city through these shanty towns. And we, at the same time, attach new importance to these type of settlements because they emerge as a way of solving some problems of absence of infrastructure and public services. The governments were not able to overcome those problems, so the population groups themselves found a way to have access to those basic services and to housing. So we are also looking not only at habitat, but also the monitoring of the works that are being done. In the platform, the initial intention was to contribute to the discussion that we should make these shanty towns, these informal settlements, visible in the maps. We had a pilot project with Google Street View so that these settlements would appear on the maps, and we undertook some other projects and experiences with other organizations that already have experience in this area. Today, we are in a different situation, although these communities are still visible in a symbolic manner. We have seen some changes. In 2015, announcements were made to urbanize 4 informal settlements in the city of Buenos Aires. And it is interesting to see how the open government tools work, how the public works control mechanisms work, how the population may take a defensive position, and in other cases it may become more proactive, looking for solutions with the support of the civil society. So now we are in a more sophisticated process. It's not just a matter of making these settlements visible and reporting the problems in terms of infrastructure, but also see how we can take advantage of what they have already built there and do the best for them. So with 80 organizations last year, we tried to define together with the residents of those urban settlements what it means to urbanize these settlements, and these urbanization processes may acquire different names. So we started looking at certain neighborhoods in order to claim for certain standards. So now these shanty towns, these urban settlements, have turned into a reservoir of or data repository that perhaps it doesn't allow for such an easy access, but we already have some public information. Perhaps making the information increasingly public may identify many other problems, but the least information we have, the least transparency we will have. So it is important for us to make this information public. And at the same time, we have implemented a monitoring tool so that the residents of these areas can follow up on the works that have been undertaken to address their needs. In perspective, we want to engage the population of these shanty towns in their improvement processes, not only because of an ethical reason, but because we believe that it is extremely possible for them to have that participation, for these processes to be successful. If we don't have public information, if they do not exert a control over the public works, if they do not participate in their own territory, probably we won't be able to have social and urban integration processes like the ones we are seeking to achieve.
Pues agradecemos mucho.
We thank the speakers very much for your presentations. We don't have much time. There may be a couple of comments from the floor. There are a couple of hands raised. But before that, to make a summary of your ideas, apparently, in order to understand the needs of this population better, we should connect the opening of the states with the concrete needs and the daily problems of these groups, of these people. And this requires rethinking the role of the OGP to create these notions of open government with a focus on rights. One of the challenges is to have the rights, OGP rights agenda, cross-cutting the agenda. And this requires opening up to new formats and to close the gaps and to think deeply on which new mechanisms to develop to overcome the technological divide. In our institute, we've actually developed capabilities for indigenous young women, but we've also identified that the access to information requires high skills on access to information. The OGP faces a significant challenge here, and also at a different level, in the level of recognition, not only to develop visibility, but also acknowledgement. And here, this platform, OGP, should wonder which will be the minimum standards, because we're talking about inclusiveness, about diversity recognition. And we should also reflect on the needs and the aspirations of this group. We have two people here to make comments, if you can give them a mic. And after the remarks, we have a 1 minute closing round. I apologize for the brevity, but they were very interesting topics, a couple of challenges and diagnostics. Thank you and congratulations for your presentations. I'm Isabela Regrena from X Justicia para las Mujeres, Justice for Women. I have a question for Dominica, and it has to do with the process you described with indigenous women. My question is whether those principles of open government, how would they apply to community authorities? And in your process, have you included the request for information in indigenous languages? Sometimes the INADE does not want to include them in indigenous languages because they are not used, and in my view, that's discrimination. There is another question. Good afternoon. I am a journalist, Wendy Funes, from the research newspaper.com from Honduras. Congratulations for the panel. My question is, how will OGP allow vulnerable groups to appropriate the right of access to public information? Because frequently, vulnerable groups say they do not use the laws because the government will eventually never answer, and it is difficult to push them to actually enforce their rights. And I'm also very interested, a question to the Canadian representative, this reconciliation with the Aboriginal peoples is just for Canada or also for Latin America? There have been reports in certain areas of exploitation of resources by some Canadian companies. Thank you very much. So that is the last question, and after that, the closing of the panel. I'm Jimena Torres. I work for the Avina Foundation from Colombia. My question is not for anyone in particular, but whoever dares reply. In Colombia, we're going through a highly complex process, which is what are we going to do after a peace process? How do we implement what is great in black and white? So in this context, we have a vulnerable population. It was very difficult for us as a society to accept that they are citizens, which are the people that have been demobilized from the guerrilla groups. Over 5,000 people who are waiting for the Colombian society to welcome them back as citizens. So, talking about open government, open policies, and access to information, with this population, which is already in a difficult position, victims of the conflict or poor rural populations, how do we get to these people who are not even accepted as legal citizens in the society? I cannot think about this at all times. In Colombia, we're trying to build upon that, but the polarization will prevent some sectors of the population to be included in society. So it is a complicated process. Thank you very much. This is the last one, if you want to answer, and then a quick conclusion. Initially, the requests were made in Spanish, but this year, there was a first request for a revision and the commissioner of the INAI ruled in favor. Whenever there is a request in a vernacular language, the reasonable adjustments of the platform should be made to meet the needs of indigenous populations. We are extremely proud of that proceeding because it's the first time that the INAI rules on this matter in an action for a revision. And we did that because of the peculiarities of the indigenous languages. And because of that, we recorded an audio, and we requested that the reply should also be in audio format because of, again, because of the peculiarities of the reading and writing of the indigenous languages. Now, in relation to your question about the community authorities, when women became information agents after the workshops and the requests for information they submitted, they were enabled as active participants in the assemblies, in the meetings. That was how they bargained, or how the process went through with the community authorities. Many of these authorities are governed by their uses and customs. And with respect to the municipal authorities, I have several success stories that we can share offline because of time constraints. But again, based on the questions they made to themselves on their own problems, they were able to start up healthcare centers, removal of people who were stealing them from their money. So the interaction with the authorities were also with the municipal authorities and with the community authorities. Well, now they on their own were able to position themselves with a better bargaining power within their communities when they became agents owning or holding information of relevance for their peoples.
I have very much time, but quickly, the process of reconciliation in Canada that I was speaking to is very much kind of an internal process of reconciliation that responds directly to some of the policies and actions that the federal government had put in place historically that were very hurtful to indigenous populations and led to the destruction of many indigenous cultures, languages, resulted in children being removed from their homes, and has just been super, super hurtful. So it's very much an internal process to try and figure out, okay, those were bad policies, those were policies of assimilation, and so how can we move forward together? We do have in Canada, just super quickly, some examples of how access to information requests can be used to help indigenous populations that have been very successful, and some court challenges that have led to rulings where they've said that indigenous populations have to be given certain access rights because those are vital to their other human rights in Canada and rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution in Canada. So I think there's some hope there, but I think it's a careful path of negotiation.
The first thing that we need to understand is that Latin America and the Caribbean are very separate regions. Well, we know this, but in terms of even how we handle certain situations, we're completely different. For Latin America, it is indigenous people who would be considered vulnerable groups, because in terms of how you handle LGBTI issues, you're far more progressive than the Caribbean. In fact, you're 100 years ahead of where we need to be. And I think that because of that, because Latin America and the Caribbean are sister regions, it is important that the principles and the ideals and the ideologies that you guys hold, it's something that you should at least try to pass on to the Caribbean. And it's something that I think that we can learn from as a region and that we can adopt. What I've always admired about Latin America is that when you do see something that needs to be changed and that needs to be addressed, and needs to be fixed. As a people, we come together and you fight for that cause. So it's not about who's in power or who's afraid of what. It's more of what is right and ensuring that what is right is carried out for the benefit of the people and not just for a specific group or a specific set. Which is something that the Caribbean does not do. We are, and I think maybe it's because we were colonized a bit differently, and we just believe that if we have leaders and they're in power, then we shouldn't question them, and we should not challenge that rule, and that cannot work because it is becoming something that is affecting not everyone but a specific group within our community, and that group is dying, and that is LGBTI people, that is women, that is girls. So I implore you, Latin America, for you to step up a bit more and to help the Caribbean to come a bit further. And of course, I'm pretty sure that the Open Government Partnership will help in that regard as well. But we do need more partners. We do need more countries like Argentina and other members of Latin America to reach out to the Caribbean and to reach out to those countries like Jamaica, which are struggling when it comes to human rights and when it comes to protecting all our citizens and not just some.
Sí. Capaz desde mi perspectiva.
From my point of view, I would like to say that we need to strengthen the strategies, principles, and plans for open government in order to achieve a democratic transformation in Latin America that will enable us to strengthen the participatory and deliberative components of democracy, so that everything seeks the welfare and well-being for all. This is very important because many people in Latin America feel that democracy fails them on a daily basis. Democracy is not just enough to guarantee their well-being. So we need to view that democratic transformation from that perspective. In the case of informal settlements, we say that this transformation should be founded on a new social territorial pact that will enable governments to pursue state reform in cooperation with other stakeholders to address the needs of the 25% of the population that resides in the cities in these conditions. Because, as Pablo said, this is the epicenter of the violation of human rights in the cities. So there are different forms of violation. We mentioned Colombia. Our data reveals that in Bogota, approximately 40% of informal settlements in Bogota have displaced groups. Those displaced by the armed conflict in Colombia end up living in these spaces in the cities. They are segregated, they are excluded, so they also face social drama. So the government should take into consideration that there are not only a lot of needs in these settlements that need to be addressed, they also need to focus on the rights aspect, because all people need to have equal access to all these benefits. And the empirical human experience has shown us in our work with the community leaders in an effort to transform their life is that there is a lot of knowledge there that can nourish new approaches and new ways of understanding coexistence, the idea of living in a community and building democracy. Thank you.
Para responder.
A quick reply to Wendy's question, and in relation to the Colombia's issue and the demobilized, the reply to the construction of trust. We have to think open government as something that is much more else than a government opening up and publishing data. Open government is the construction of a common goal. Our experience shows that each one from our own place with our own responsibilities, that is the challenge. That the difficulties, the problems, and the challenges themselves should be collective, not individual, not just of the government. We should all sit at the same table. So I think that the big challenge is the construction of trust and commitment, that all actors from our places, we should pledge to fulfill that. And that is a process. It's not done overnight. It could be long and difficult, but it should be started at some point in time. And as I said before, we should prove that we can prove that open government and participation works, and we should start by something minor, but we should start. A couple of ideas. A concrete action is that tools can be appropriated by communities. In slums, the community leaders ask for information at times, for instance, when the budget is being debated. So these tools, when they work, they are used. Another general issue related to what she said is that if we stay with the formal characteristics of open government indicators and we run through the checklist and that is all, our contribution will not be significant or can even be counterproductive if we stay on the formal. If it is not useful for the purpose of solving public problems, it becomes a cosmetic solution and it damages rights. So these tools should make a substantial contribution, and the government should address the way they are used. Otherwise, they will not be able to revert the damaging of the rights we are seeking for. Thank you very much for your participation, and apologies for taking over the time of the next panel, and thanks to the organizers.